My name is Patricia. I'm 47 years old, and for most of my life, I've been chasing approval that always seemed just out of reach. I grew up in Boston, Massachusetts, in a household where achievement was currency and anything less than exceptional was considered disappointing. My father, Robert Callahan, was a successful corporate lawyer who'd built his entire identity around his career. My mother, Susan, had been a homemaker who passed away when I was 19, leaving behind a void that my father filled with even more work and even higher expectations for me. I was the youngest of 3 children. My older brother, Michael, had followed directly in Dad's footsteps and become a lawyer at a prestigious firm in New York. My sister, Caroline, had married a wealthy businessman and lived in Connecticut with her perfect family in their perfect house. Then there was me, Patricia, the one who'd always been a half step behind, the one who tried so hard but never quite measured up in my father's eyes. I'd spent 23 years working in corporate communications for a pharmaceutical company in downtown Boston. It wasn't a glamorous position, but it was stable and respectable. I wrote press releases, managed internal newsletters, coordinated company events, and handled crisis communications when needed. The pay was decent, enough to afford a comfortable apartment in Somerville and maintain the lifestyle my father expected of his children. But I'd never loved it. The work felt hollow, like I was arranging words to make corporations sound caring, when often they weren't. Still, I stayed because it was safe, because it was what was expected, because disappointing my father was something I'd spent my entire life trying to avoid. My personal life reflected that same pattern of settling for safe over satisfying. I'd been engaged once in my early 30s to a man named Derek who worked in finance. Dad had loved him, constantly praising his ambition and his earning potential. But Derek and I had nothing in common beyond our addresses in the same city. After 3 years together, I'd called off the engagement, recognizing that marrying someone to please my father was a recipe for misery. Dad had been furious, telling me I was throwing away a good man because I was too picky and too idealistic. Since then, I dated occasionally but never seriously, preferring the company of my close friends and my rescue dog, Bailey, a golden retriever mix who'd been my constant companion for 5 years. The pharmaceutical company where I worked had been going through changes for months. There were whispers of restructuring, of downsizing, of departments being consolidated. In meetings, executives used euphemisms like streamlining operations and optimizing resources, which everyone knew meant layoffs were coming. I tried not to worry. I'd been there for over 2 decades, had good performance reviews, and was considered reliable. Surely that counted for something. It was a cold Tuesday in November when my manager, Helen, called me into her office. The moment I saw her expression, I knew. She was a kind woman in her 50s who'd always treated me fairly, and right now she looked genuinely distressed. "Patricia, please sit down. I'm afraid I have difficult news." My heart started pounding, but I kept my face neutral, a skill I'd perfected over years of corporate life. "Due to the restructuring, we're eliminating several positions in communications. Your role is one of them. I'm so sorry, Patricia. This isn't about your performance. You've been an asset to this company. It's purely a business decision." She continued talking about severance packages, continuation of benefits, and outplacement services, but I barely heard her. 23 years, and it came down to this: a 15-minute conversation in a sterile office, a folder of paperwork, and a cardboard box for my desk belongings. I signed the documents in a daze, cleaned out my desk while former colleagues averted their eyes, and walked out of the building at 2 p.m. on a weekday, something I'd never done in all my years there. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes, gripping the steering wheel and trying to process what had just happened. I was unemployed, at 47, in a competitive job market that favored younger candidates. The rational part of my brain reminded me that I had severance, that I had savings, that I had options. But the louder part, the part that sounded disturbingly like my father's voice, kept repeating, "You failed. You couldn't even keep a job. What's wrong with you?" I drove home mechanically, let myself into my apartment, and was greeted enthusiastically by Bailey, who had no idea that my entire world had just shifted. I sat on the floor and hugged him, letting his uncomplicated love provide comfort that I couldn't find anywhere else. Then I did what I'd been conditioned to do my entire life. I called my father. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice brisk and professional, even though he'd been retired for 2 years. Patricia, this is unexpected. Is everything all right? Dad, I need to tell you something. I lost my job today. The company restructured and eliminated my position. There was a pause, and I could practically hear him formulating his response, arranging his words the way a lawyer arranges arguments. I see. Well, this is unfortunate timing. How long was your notice period? There wasn't one. It was effective immediately. I have severance for 3 months. Another pause. Effective immediately? Patricia, were you aware this was coming? Had there been warnings about your performance? No, Dad. It wasn't performance-related. It was a company-wide restructuring. Companies don't eliminate positions held by valuable employees, Patricia. If you'd been truly essential, they would have found a place for you. 23 years, and you couldn't make yourself indispensable? What exactly have you been doing all this time? His words hit like physical blows. I'd expected disappointment, but the sharpness of his criticism caught me off guard. Dad, that's not fair. Hundreds of people were let go. It's always about value, Patricia. Michael made partner at his firm because he made himself invaluable. Caroline married well because she understood the importance of strategic decisions. But you've always been content with mediocrity, haven't you? Content to just coast along in some middle management position that anyone could do. Tears were streaming down my face now, but my voice remained steady. I worked hard at that job, Dad, for over 2 decades. Hard work isn't enough if you're working hard at being unremarkable. I'm disappointed, Patricia. Truly disappointed. At your age, you should be at the peak of your career, not getting cut loose like some entry-level employee. This is what happens when you don't apply yourself, when you don't push for excellence. You're a failure, Patricia. I hate to say it, but someone needs to be honest with you. That word hung in the air between us. Failure. It was the summation of every fear I'd carried since childhood, the label I'd run from my entire life, now spoken aloud by the person whose approval I'd craved most. Something inside me cracked, but surprisingly, it didn't break me. It broke something else instead, the hold his opinion had on my sense of self-worth. I found myself smiling through my tears, a reaction so unexpected it surprised even me. Dad, you still don't know? Don't know what? His voice was sharp with irritation. You don't know who I actually am. You never have. You've spent my entire life telling me who I should be, what I should want, how I should live, but you've never once asked me what I want, what I dream about, what makes me happy. Dreams don't pay bills, Patricia. Happiness doesn't build careers. No, but maybe happiness is the career, Dad. Maybe I've spent 23 years being miserable in a job I didn't care about because I was trying to live up to an image of success that isn't even mine. Maybe losing this job isn't failure. Maybe it's freedom. Freedom? He laughed bitterly. You're unemployed at 47 with no prospects and no plan. That's not freedom. That's irresponsibility. That's exactly the kind of naive thinking that's held you back your entire life. You know what, Dad? I need to go. I appreciate you taking my call. Patricia, don't you dare hang up on me. We need to discuss. I ended the call. For the first time in my life, I hung up on my father. My hands were shaking, but I felt oddly liberated, as if I'd been carrying a massive weight for decades and had finally set it down. Bailey nuzzled my hand, and I scratched behind his ears, grounding myself in the moment. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed replaying the conversation, examining the life I'd built, and realizing how much of it had been constructed to please someone else. The corporate job I'd endured, the serious, professional persona I'd maintained, the apartment in the right neighborhood, the careful choices designed to earn approval that never came. When had I stopped living for myself and started living for an audience of one perpetually disappointed person? Around 3 a.m, I got up and made tea. Sitting at my kitchen table with Bailey at my feet, I pulled out a notebook and started writing. Not plans or job search strategies, but questions. What do I actually want? If I could do anything, what would it be? What have I always been too afraid to try? The answers surprised me. I wanted to write, really write. Not corporate communications, but stories and essays about real things. I wanted to volunteer with animal rescue organizations. I wanted to take pottery classes, something I'd been drawn to for years but dismissed as impractical. I wanted to travel, to see places beyond business conferences and family obligations. I wanted to wake up excited about my day instead of dreading it. I wanted to stop apologizing for who I was and start celebrating it. Over the next few days, I avoided my family's calls. Michael left a message saying Dad had told him about my situation and offering to send my resume to some contacts. His tone suggesting he was doing me a tremendous favor. Caroline texted saying she hoped I'd learn from this experience and make better choices going forward. Their messages, like Dad's words, all carried the same underlying assumption: that I'd failed, that I needed fixing, that their way of life was the only valid one. But something had shifted in me that night. Dad called me a failure. His words, meant to shame me into conformity, had instead freed me from caring about his version of success. I started researching freelance writing opportunities, looking at platforms where I could pitch stories and essays. I contacted local animal shelters about volunteer opportunities. I enrolled in a weekend pottery workshop. I started saying yes to things that interested me and no to things that didn't, regardless of how they looked to others. The severance package from my job was generous enough to give me breathing room. Instead of immediately scrambling to replicate my old position, I gave myself permission to explore. I picked up freelance communications work that I could do remotely, enough to supplement my savings, but not so much that it consumed my life. The rest of my time, I devoted to the things I'd neglected for decades. I started writing personal essays about my experiences in corporate America, about the pressure to conform, about the cost of chasing approval. I submitted them to online publications and literary magazines. The rejections came frequently at first, but so did occasional acceptances. Seeing my words in print, my real thoughts and experiences, rather than carefully sanitized corporate messaging, felt more validating than any performance review I'd ever received. The animal shelter welcomed my volunteer application enthusiastically. I started spending 3 afternoons a week there, walking dogs, socializing cats, and helping with adoption events. The work was unglamorous: cleaning kennels, dealing with scared animals, managing heartbreak when adoptions fell through. But it felt meaningful in a way my corporate job never had. I was making a tangible difference in lives that depended on human kindness. The pottery class became a weekly highlight. I was terrible at it initially, my bowls lopsided and my vases collapsing. But the instructor, a patient woman named Rosa, who'd left her own corporate career years earlier, encouraged experimentation over perfection. "Clay is forgiving," she'd say. "You can always start over." There was a metaphor in that I couldn't ignore. 3 months after losing my job, I received an email from a national magazine accepting one of my essays for publication. The piece was about the myth of corporate loyalty, about how companies demand dedication but rarely reciprocate it. They were paying $500, more than I'd made on any freelance piece yet. I read the acceptance letter 3 times, then called my best friend, Jenna, who'd been my closest confidant since college. "They bought it!" I practically screamed when she answered. "The essay about getting laid off, they're publishing it!" Jenna's excitement matched mine. "Patricia, that's incredible. See, I told you that you could do this. You're a real writer now." "I'm a real writer with $500 and no health insurance," I joked, but I was beaming. "You're happier than I've heard you in years," Jenna observed. "Your dad's still giving you grief?" I sobered slightly. "We haven't really talked since that first night. He's made it clear through Michael and Caroline that he thinks I'm wasting my time and my life. Apparently, freelance writing and volunteering at animal shelters don't count as real work in his worldview." "His loss," Jenna said firmly. "He's missing out on knowing the real you, the you that's been buried under corporate Patricia for so long." She was right. The version of me that was emerging, the one who wore jeans to pottery class and got dog hair all over her clothes at the shelter and stayed up late writing essays about things that mattered to her, felt more authentic than the polished professional who'd spent decades in business casual attire. My essay was published in January, 4 months after I'd lost my job. The magazine sent me a physical copy, and I held it in my hands with a sense of accomplishment that far exceeded anything I'd felt in my corporate career. The piece resonated with readers. I received dozens of emails from people sharing their own stories of job loss and reinvention. A few other publications reached out, asking if I'd be interested in writing for them. Slowly, carefully, I was building something new. Around this time, Caroline called. It was late on a Sunday afternoon, and I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out. "Patricia, I read your article, the one in the magazine. I braced myself for criticism. "Oh? What did you think?" There was a pause. "It was really good, Pat. Really honest. I had no idea you felt that way about your career, about Dad's expectations. Why didn't you ever say anything? Would it have mattered? You and Michael seemed happy on the path Dad laid out for you." "Happy?" Caroline laughed, but it sounded hollow. "I'm in therapy twice a week trying to figure out why I feel so empty despite having everything I'm supposed to want. Michael's on blood pressure medication at 49 and never sees his kids. We're not happy, Patricia. We're performing happiness. You're the only one who had the courage to stop performing." Her admission stunned me. I'd spent my whole life believing my siblings had it figured out, that they'd achieved the success I'd failed to reach. The idea that they were struggling too had never occurred to me. "Caroline, I'm sorry. I didn't know." "Of course you didn't. We're all too busy pretending everything's perfect to admit when it's not. That's what Dad taught us, right? Never show weakness. Never admit struggle. Just keep climbing that ladder, even if it's leaning against the wrong building." We talked for over an hour, really talked in a way we hadn't since we were children. She told me about her marriage, which looked perfect from the outside, but felt loveless from within. She talked about her children, who were growing up with the same pressure to perform that we'd experienced. She confessed that reading my essay had made her question everything about her life. I told her about my journey, about the fear and uncertainty, but also the joy and authenticity. We cried together, laughed together, and in that conversation found a sisterhood that had been dormant for decades. "Have you talked to Dad at all?" she asked eventually. "No. He made his feelings pretty clear. I'm a failure in his eyes, and I don't think an essay in a magazine is going to change that. He read it, you know. I mentioned it at Sunday dinner, and he got very quiet. Later, I saw him looking it up on his tablet. He didn't say anything about it, but he read every word." That image stayed with me. My father, alone with his tablet, reading his daughter's words about the cost of his expectations. I wondered what he'd thought, if anything had penetrated that armor of certainty he wore. But I didn't reach out. The ball was in his court now. By spring, 6 months after losing my job, I'd built a sustainable freelance career. It wasn't making me rich, but combined with my shelter work and pottery classes, it was making me fulfilled. I'd also started fostering dogs through the rescue, giving temporary homes to animals waiting for adoption. My apartment was smaller and messier than when I'd been trying to impress my father's imaginary, judgmental eye, but it felt more like home than anywhere I'd ever lived. One afternoon in April, I was at the shelter helping with an adoption event when my phone rang. It was my father. I almost declined the call, but something made me answer. "Dad, Patricia, I'm calling to see if you're available for dinner tomorrow evening. Just the two of us." His voice sounded different, less certain, almost hesitant. I suppose I could be." "Where?" "That Italian place in the North End you used to like. Luigi's, 6 o'clock? "Okay, I'll be there." He hung up without explanation, leaving me confused and anxious. Jenna, who'd witnessed the call, raised her eyebrows. "Your dad wants dinner? That's unexpected." "I have no idea what to expect," I admitted. "This could go very badly, or it could go very well. Maybe he's finally ready to actually see you." The next evening, I changed clothes 3 times before settling on nice jeans and a simple blouse, refusing to dress up in business casual just to please him. I arrived at Luigi's exactly on time and found Dad already seated at a corner table. He stood when he saw me, and I noticed he looked older, more tired than when I'd last seen him at Thanksgiving. "Patricia, thank you for coming." We sat down, ordered wine, and endured several minutes of awkward small talk about the weather and the restaurant. Finally, after the waiter took our dinner orders, Dad cleared his throat. "I read your essay, the one in the magazine. Caroline mentioned that. I've actually read several of your pieces now. I found your other publications online." He paused, seeming to struggle with what to say next. "They're very good, Patricia. Very honest. Painfully honest in some ways." I waited, saying nothing. "You wrote about feeling like you were never enough, like you were constantly chasing approval you couldn't reach, about building a life to please others rather than yourself." He looked directly at me for the first time. "Was I the other you were referring to?" The question hung between us. I could have softened it, made it easier for him, but I decided on honesty. "Yes, Dad, you were." He nodded slowly, looking down at his wine glass. "I thought I was pushing you to excellence, pushing all of you to be the best versions of yourselves. I didn't realize I was pushing you to be versions of me." "We're not you, Dad. None of us are, and we shouldn't have to be. No, he agreed quietly. You shouldn't. I'm beginning to understand that, though perhaps too late. He paused. When you lost your job and I called you a failure, you said something that's haunted me. You said I didn't know you, that I'd never known you. Were you right? I considered the question carefully. I don't think you ever asked who I was, Dad. You told me who I should be, what I should want, how I should live, but you never asked what I wanted for myself. So I'm asking now. What do you want, Patricia? It was such a simple question, one he'd never asked in 47 years, and it nearly broke me. I want to write stories that matter. I want to help animals who need love. I want to create things with my hands. I want to wake up excited about my day instead of dreading it. I want relationships based on who I actually am, not who I pretend to be. I want to stop apologizing for wanting those things. Dad was quiet for a long moment. Those are good wants, worthy wants. And you're doing them? I'm trying. The shelter work, the pottery, the writing. You're happy doing those things? Happier than I've been in decades. He nodded slowly. I owe you an apology, Patricia. Several apologies, actually. For that night on the phone when I called you a failure. For decades of making you feel like you weren't enough. For measuring your worth by my standards instead of your own. For being so focused on the life I thought you should have that I never saw the life you wanted. Tears welled in my eyes. I'd waited my whole life to hear something like this, and now that it was happening, I didn't know how to respond. I don't know if I can be the father you deserved, he continued. I'm old, Patricia, and set in my ways, but I'd like to try to be the father you have, who knows his daughter and values her for who she actually is. If you're willing to give me that chance. Why now? I asked. What changed? He smiled sadly. I've had a lot of time since retiring. Too much time to sit with my thoughts and realize how little I actually know my own children. Michael barely speaks to me beyond obligatory calls. Caroline maintains a perfect facade, but never lets me past it. And you, the daughter who tried hardest to please me, finally stopped trying. Your essay made me realize I'd spent so much energy pushing all of you up a ladder that I never noticed you weren't happy climbing it. Our food arrived, and we ate slowly, the conversation flowing more naturally than it had in years. He asked about my writing, my shelter work, my pottery. Really asked, with genuine interest rather than thinly veiled judgment. I told him about the dogs I was fostering, about the essays I was working on, about feeling like I was finally living instead of just existing. You smiled that night, he said, as we finished dinner. When I called you a failure, you smiled and said I still didn't know. What did you mean? I thought back to that moment, to the breaking point that had become a breakthrough. I meant that you didn't know I'd been waiting my whole life to stop being who you wanted and start being who I am. Losing my job freed me to do that. What you saw as failure, I saw as possibility. You didn't know that because you'd never asked what I wanted, never considered that your version of success might not be mine. And I smiled because I realized something important. Your disappointment in me didn't have to be my disappointment in myself. I could choose differently. I could define success on my own terms. That realization was liberating, Dad. Probably the most liberating moment of my life. He reached across the table and took my hand, something he hadn't done since I was a small child. I'm sorry I made you wait 47 years to feel that liberation. I'm proud of you, Patricia. Not for the career I thought you should have, but for the courage to build the life you actually want. That takes more strength than I gave you credit for. Those words, simple as they were, healed something in me I hadn't realized was still bleeding. We finished dinner and walked through the North End together, talking about everything and nothing, father and daughter finally meeting as the people we actually were rather than the roles we'd been playing. Our relationship didn't transform overnight. There were still moments when his old patterns emerged, when he'd start to offer unsolicited advice or make judgments about my choices. But now, he'd catch himself, apologize, and ask questions instead. He started reading all my published work, offering thoughtful feedback rather than criticism. He even came to an art show where my pottery was displayed, standing awkwardly among the bohemian crowd, but genuinely admiring my work. Michael and Caroline noticed the change too. Family dinners became less performative, more honest. We started talking about our real lives, our struggles and fears, not just our accomplishments. Michael admitted he hated being a lawyer, but felt trapped by golden handcuffs and expectations. Caroline began couples counseling with her husband, working to build something authentic rather than just maintaining appearances. We were all, in our own ways, trying to untangle ourselves from the web of expectations we'd been raised in. A year after losing my job, I received an offer to write a book based on my essays about corporate life and reinvention. The advance wasn't huge, but it was enough to sustain me while I wrote. I called Dad to tell him, nervous about his reaction. "That's wonderful, Patricia. When do you start?" "Right away, I suppose. I'm terrified, honestly. What if I can't do it? What if it's terrible?" "Then you'll revise it until it's not terrible. That's what writers do, isn't it?" "But Patricia, can I tell you something? I've read everything you've published this year. You can do this. You have important things to say and the skill to say them well. Trust yourself." Those words, coming from a man who'd spent decades undermining my confidence, meant everything. "Thanks, Dad. That means a lot. I know I wasn't always supportive. I'm trying to make up for that now, even if it's late." "It's not too late," I assured him. "It's never too late to start being who we really are." The night I lost my job, my father called me a failure, and in that moment, something broke free. Not my spirit, but the chains I'd been wearing my entire life. The chains of other people's expectations, of borrowed definitions of success, of living for approval instead of authenticity. When I smiled and said, "Dad, you still don't know?" I was claiming my right to define my own life, my own worth, my own path. Now, sitting in my small apartment with Bailey asleep at my feet, a fostered puppy snoring in a crate nearby, pottery drying on my windowsill, and my laptop open to a book manuscript, I understand what real success looks like. It looks like waking up excited about the day ahead. It looks like work that feeds your soul instead of just your bank account. It looks like relationships based on honesty instead of performance. It looks like becoming more yourself with each passing day instead of less. My father eventually learned who I was, but more importantly, I learned who I was. And I learned that sometimes the things that look like endings, like failures, like disasters, are actually doorways to the life you were meant to live all along. You just have to be brave enough to walk through them, even when everyone around you is calling you foolish for leaving behind what you should want. The smile I gave my father that night wasn't one of defiance or bitterness. It was one of recognition and release. Recognition that his disappointment no longer defined me, and release from the exhausting work of trying to be someone I wasn't. It was the smile of a woman finally coming home to herself after a lifetime of wandering in someone else's vision of who she should be. And that, I've discovered, is worth more than any corporate title, any salary, any approval from anyone who doesn't truly see you. That is success on terms that actually matter. That is the life I was always meant to live, the one I finally had the courage to claim.